my name is Pascal. Today we are going to discuss whether Stronglifts 5x5 is a good program, and my answer to that will be a resounding yes. I've done it myself, and I encourage you to read the entire 10,000 word review that I have linked in the description box below. I've run the program in 2015 and I've reworked the article in 2021 with more experience under my belt. I think when you Google the program at the moment, the reputation of it is a lot more negative than it should be, and I will outline in this video of why I think that. To evaluate whether a program is good, you need a certain framework. The framework I will be using is the one outlined in Scientific Principles of Strength Training, written by Chad Wesley Smith and Mike Israeletti. One of them has a PhD, so they kind of know what they're talking about. The other one is training multiple international champions in powerlifting. Check out the ebook that is about 360 pages strong if you want to go into the details. But the 7 principles are specificity, overload, fatigue management, Stimulus-Recovery-Adaptation, phase potentiation, individual differences, and variation. Sorry for the last one, I had to look. So we will run through all of these and explain why Stronglifts 5x5 I think is actually a strong program for beginners, and that the current feedback that you get when you Google it is actually a lot worse than the program actually is. The first principle of scientific strength training is specificity. So specificity is always aligned to a certain goal. Now, the goal of Stronglifts 5x5 is to write a good program for beginners who are equally interested in hypertrophy and strength gains. And for that, Stronglifts 5x5 is actually, in my opinion, one of the best programs that you find out there. Suboptimal, yes, for powerlifting. True, but that is not what the program was written for. Suboptimal for muscle gains, yes, true, but that was not the intended purpose of the program. The intended purpose of the program is to specifically get beginners interested in barbell training, keep it as simple as possible for them when they are undecided between hypertrophy and strength gains. And in my opinion, that also applies to most of beginners. So that actually makes it a good program, because 4 out of the 7 principles are present in the program design. And the 2 most important, which are specificity and overload, are actually addressed very, very well in Stronglifts 5x5. You can argue the other ones a little bit, and we'll get into that, but a program specifically designed for beginners to get them started on a barbell in between hypertrophy and strength training, for that, the design is very, very good. The next scientific principle of strength training is overload, and this states that the average stimuli has to be greater over time than the stimuli before. So simply put, over time you should lift more weight. And that is definitely happening within Stronglifts 5x5. In fact, the linear progression within Stronglifts 5x5 is rather aggressive compared to other more intermediate or even advanced programs. So in that instance, Stronglifts 5x5 does a very, very good job of managing overload within the program. And it is also very appropriate for beginners, because you can accelerate the weight a bit faster with beginners. Now, some people might say it's ridiculous to start on an empty barbell, but to be honest, that is also something very good for beginners, because then you can work on your technique And you will also get a positive feedback loop of adding more weight to the barbell each session. Because the effect you want to have with beginners is that they're actually getting excited about training. All of that work harder mentality and pushing yourself as hard as you possibly can in the beginning will just make people drop out of the program. And we're not doing Navy SEALs training here where you just want to keep the people that have the grit. We want to enjoy ourselves and get stronger and bigger in the progress. And Stronglifts 5x5 delivers a good ramp up for that. The next principle of scientific strength training is fatigue management. Now, at least there is some fatigue management in Stronglifts 5x5 present. So whenever you fail a load on a specific lift more than 3 times, then you should take a deload based on how the program is outlined. There are better ways to manage fatigue. That is certainly true. You can do active recovery. You can do a bit more of a phased approach where the volume comes in waves. But to be honest, that type of fatigue management can get fairly complex and is therefore more suited for people who are already dedicated to training. So therefore, the simplistic approach of fatigue management in Stronglifts 5x5 again is suboptimal for advanced and intermediate lifters, but is very simplified and therefore good for beginners to have an easy access to a very well structured accelerating program for the first 6 to 18 months of their lifting, especially if they're unsupervised and only go by the app and the online instructions. The next scientific principle of strength training is Stimulus-Recovery-Adaptation. So what is this all about? Stimulus is your training session. So the harder and longer you train, the higher the stimulus. The recovery period is the period where your body actually manages the stress that you put it under and within that recovery adapts. So the bigger and the more you lift, the longer these curves of stimulus, recovery and adaptation become. Now, within Stronglifts 5x5, there's not a lot of attention to stimulus, recovery, adaptation being paid, but that is actually good for beginners. Now, why is that good for beginners? Because beginners usually will recover and adapt within a day because they're fairly new. They have very, very good learning curves. So whenever you start something, the learning curve is very steep. And also the load that you put on the individual is actually not that big. Now we will go to individual differences later, but basically you can go through a full cycle of stimulus, recovery and adaptation with Stronglifts 5x5 within a day, especially in the beginning. So therefore it makes sense to not overcomplicate this concept for this program and just give people 3 sessions a week from which they will recover anyway. Of course, the whole principle of stimulus, recovery, adaptation could be addressed more optimally towards either the goal of muscle building or the goal of strength building, but that would also add in a certain amount of complexity that, in my opinion, you want to avoid for beginners like the plague, because they're busy enough getting in the gym at all. Never mind overcomplicating things with big spreadsheets, adaptation, recovery, stimulus. Just get training. You will grow anyway, especially if you're young and if you are a beginner. If you want to train optimally, yes, get a coach. But then why are you looking at a cookie cutter program? So you see where I'm going with this. Another principle of scientific strength training is variation. So what does variation mean? Variation means that you vary the specific exercises in your program to a certain degree so that you don't get too bored and lose motivation or overuse some of your joints or muscles in the process. So variations can be range of motion, or you use bands instead of plates for resistance. It is how long you pause somewhere, anything you could possibly think of to manipulate the range of motion or how the resistance is being distributed. Now, in all fairness, Stronglifts 5x5 does very, very poorly on that, because it is the same over and over and over again. A program with a lot of variation in it is the West Side method. So if you want to understand the benefits of variation, then study up on West Side method, and you will clearly see what it is all about. Because in the West Side method, you vary your grip almost on every set, you will vary your stance on almost every set, and that makes you gain longer for more. But again, with beginners, which Stronglifts 5x5 has been designed for, you want to get the basics and the foundation very, very strong and solid. So to violate one of the minor principles in return for simplicity and clarity on learning the big lifts properly is a good trade-off, especially as variation is really one of the minor principles, while the main principles, specificity and overload, are being addressed. The next principle to discuss is phase potentiation. So what does that mean? That means that each block of your training actually builds on the other. So for powerlifting specifically, this would mean that a hypertrophy block with a lot of repetitions builds on a strength block. So the strength block has mid-range repetitions, mid-range intensity, and then you end up with a peaking block where you actually funnel all of that towards a 1 repetition maximum. Now within Stronglifts 5x5, because there are no differently designed blocks, you don't really have phase potentiation as such. You just do the same thing over and over and over until you drop out and start a program that actually has more of a phase potentiation approach. But again, that is not necessarily bad, because as a beginner, keep it simple, keep it stupid, do it over and over and over, and make it more complex once you need to. If you do make gains on a very, very simple template, that is not a bad thing. That is actually pretty good. Why make it more complex just to make it optimal and then drop out and get all confused? So you see where I'm going with this. You want to keep it simple to keep people engaged or yourself engaged. The complexity will come with itself. And once you make a decision for I want to be as big as Arnold or I want to be as strong as Ed Cohen, then of course optimize things. But that is a complexity that you probably don't want when you're starting out, especially if you're still unsure about whether you want to barbell train or not. So phase potentiation, more or less not existent in Stronglifts 5x5, but in return I would ask, is that really relevant to a beginner? I would say no. So the last principle to address is individual differences. In the framework of the scientific principles of strength training, that is actually the least important, surprisingly, even though it is one of the ones that is called out most on cookie cutter programs, because what is in back with cookie cutter programs is that they treat everybody equally. So there's no individual difference. Therefore, Stronglifts 5x5 does very poorly on individual differences. Now, when is that relevant for a beginner? Very different thing. It becomes relevant when you are actually at the extremes from the median. So most of these lifting programs assume a male in their 20s with general good health. So if you don't have general good health, if you're not a median male, and if you're far removed from 20 years old, then the barbell might be too heavy to you to work with. That's one issue. Or you have some kind of health history that prohibits you from lifting heavy or lifting barbells and moving in certain ways. Okay, fair enough. If you weigh 50 kg, for example, an overhead press with an empty barbell for 5x5 is already fairly challenging. If you enter Stronglifts 5x5 as a football linebacker in high school who weighs 250 pounds and can rip out a tree, okay, then you don't want to start with an empty barbell. But you know, those are exceptions from the rule. That is not really the median. And for the median, I would personally say that these individual differences don't matter as much. Just get started with Stronglifts 5x5 and get into the routine of training with a barbell 3 times a week. So to conclude everything along the 7 principles of scientific strength training, 2 out of the 7 which are the most important, which are specificity and overload, are addressed very, very well if the goal is to get beginners started on a barbell when they're undecided between hypertrophy or muscle gain and strength. The next 2 principles, fatigue management and stimulus recovery and adaptation, are also addressed very simple because beginners recover very, very fast. So why overcomplicate things? So 4 out of the 7 principles are addressed well within Stronglifts 5x5. The last 3 are the most complex ones and also the most relevant the further you go on in your lifting career. So therefore, I still think that Stronglifts 5x5 is a good program for beginners because everything that it is being called out on is Stronglifts 5x5 either not designed for, or it only becomes relevant once you're more experienced. So really the main word here is beginner. And for a beginner, you want to get into a positive feedback loop as fast as possible so that you want to train more and more and more and start being into it, reading into it, repeating things, challenging yourself, questioning it, rather than overcomplicating things in the beginning and then not getting any work done. So that is why I think Stronglifts 5x5 is still an excellent program, even though it has gotten a bad rap quite lately, as you know, we live unfortunately in a culture where people want to see the fly in the soup rather than the soup. So that's from my side. Please like, subscribe and tell your friends about my channel and have a very nice day. Bye bye.